Hi everyone, my name's Tom and I'm a JavaScript React developer from London. Hope everyone's had a great Christmas, feeling well rested. I've had a bit of free time over the holidays, so I've decided to make this video about removing duplicate values from an array. And I'm going to be using TDD with Jest. So if you don't know what TDD is, it's basically a way of working in software development where you first create your tests and your expectations before writing the sort of minimal amount of code that will satisfy those tests. And then it's about refactoring that code and making it better, more efficient, and then eventually you get a finished product. And then 6 months down the line, when someone comes to look at your code and wants to change a bit of functionality, TDD is great because all the tests are written, and then it allows for continuous integration where someone can add a new piece of functionality and it's going to alert them if they break any of your tests that you've put in place. So it's a really great way of building a sort of scalable app. So today I'm going to be using this example, removing duplicates from an array, and I'm going to start off with the sort of a brute force way of solving this, an algorithm, and then I'm going to sort of iterate and refactor it until I get down to a one-line solution, all using Jest and React. So I hope you enjoy the video. So I'm going to show you the different methods that you can use. So the first method we'll go through is just using a classic for loop, and you actually use index of. All of these will become a bit clearer when I go through them, but same thing again, using includes. And then if you're not too bothered about the order in which your numbers appear in your array, you can sort them and then loop through, and it's actually a bit more efficient if you do it that way. Another way is using reduce, which is a sort of newer JavaScript thing that they brought in, and it's quite powerful actually. And then two different ways at the bottom, number 5 and 6, which is sort of probably a bit more elegant way to do it, with number 6 being the shortest, and you can actually do this in one line of code. So if we go into the examples now, what I've done is I've set up a sort of a fresh create React app. So if I go into the code, you can see it's like a fresh project. I've just called it remove duplicates. Open up the source folder. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create 2 new files. I'm going to call the first one remove duplicates.test.js. So the test suffix just tells Jest that it's going to be a sort of test file. And then I'm going to create its equivalent, which won't be a test file, it'll be just .js like that. And then what I like to do when I'm doing TDD is I like to have my test open on the left, and then on the right I'll have the sort of the function that I'm writing for that test. So obviously this is quite a good way to do it because you can have your terminal down the bottom running your tests, and then you can see you read left to right. So obviously you start on the left, you write your tests, and then you start implementing the functionality behind those tests to make them satisfy the expectations. So first thing we're going to start off by doing, we're actually going to have to import a function that I haven't made yet, but so it's going to be called remove duplicates. I'm going to import that from .dash remove duplicates. So when I do make a function in here, that's going to make sure it's imported under this name. And then what you want to do when you're setting up TDD with Jest is you want to use the word describe. And describe takes 2 arguments basically. So the first one will be a string, and that will be like sort of describing what you're doing, hence the name. And then the second is a callback function. So I'm just going to use an arrow function here. You could use a classic function, but I'm going to use an arrow function because it's a bit cleaner, a bit more concise. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to say function, so I'm going to describe what it is. So it's a function to remove duplicates from an array. So I'm going to leave it like that, and then so I'll build the skeleton first. Inside your callback function, this is where you're going to write your tests. So the way most people do it, I think the industry standard is basically you write it, and it is in a similar way to describe, takes a string, and then it takes a callback function as well. So this will become clearer what we're doing as I go through and work through, but I'm sort of just building the skeleton at the moment. And you can have multiple tests like this inside your describe, but I'm just going to keep it simple for now. So I'm going to write the sort of the most basic test just to show you how it all works. So I'm going to say it should remove duplicate values. And then inside this callback function, I'm going to comment these out actually. I'm going to go given, when, then. So here's when I'm going to declare my array. So I'm just going to call it numbers because I'm going to have an array of numbers. So let's say it's 1, 2, actually I'll go 1, 1, 2, 3, 2, 5, something like that, okay? So that's my array of numbers, and as you can see there's duplicate values in here, so 1 appears more than once, and similarly with 2. So under my then, I'm going to start writing my expectation for what my function is going to do. So obviously this function is called remove duplicates. So I'm going to use the word expect, and then you do dot to be, like that. And basically inside these parentheses you're writing your expectations. So I'm going to write the most simple test that you can write just to see if it works. So I'm going to write expect true to be true. And as you can see down here in the console below, it's this test is passed. If I break this test now, so if I change this to false, obviously true doesn't equal false. So you can see it's telling me one test failed down the bottom here. And if I scroll up, I can see exactly what's happened. So it's saying it was expecting to see false, but it's received true. So that's where my problem is basically. So I'll change this back to, actually I'll get rid of this for now. So eventually I'm going to want to see, if I remove all the duplicates from this array, I'm going to want to see 1, 2, 3 and 5 in an array. And then I'm going to be calling this function. So I've called it up here, or I've imported it up here. So I'm just going to call it in there and invoke it. And then eventually I'm going to be passing this numbers array to that function for it to sort of do its magic on that array. So now I've got my test set up. So obviously it's failing at the moment because I'm not returning anything, or this function doesn't exist basically. So I'm going to start writing the functionality to make this test pass. So what I'm going to do is, straight away I know this is listening for a remove duplicates function. So I'm going to export a function called remove duplicates. Pretty simple. And this is going to take an argument of numbers. And then inside this function I want to return eventually 1, 2, 3, 5, like that. Now as you can see down below, it's saying this test has failed. So if I scroll up and have a look, it's saying expected this but received this, and from an initial look these look the same. So visually speaking they have no difference, as you can see here. saying compared values have no difference or no visual difference. Note that you're testing for equality with the stricter to be. So the problem here is the syntax that I'm using. So at the moment I'm saying expect this to be that. Well, in actual fact, to be is quite strict in the sense that it's expecting this to be exactly that, which in terms of JavaScript it isn't. They're different arrays, they just happen to have the same sort of value. So what we want to use instead, so yeah, you can see down here actually it's saying matcher using object.is. So basically the object.is in JavaScript, what that does is it compares two values and it tells you whether they're the same thing. So say I had a variable and I set it to this array, and I said expect to be that variable, and I return that variable, that would be alright. But because I have two separate arrays, if you like, this is going to fail always. So to be is alright if you're comparing sort of primitive types like strings, booleans, numbers. So I'll give you an example. So expect to be hello, my name is Tom. And I return that string here. And that test is going to pass. It will also work with to_equal, but if you're using primitives like this, primitive types, then to be is actually going to be a bit faster. So if you have thousands and thousands of tests, then there's no point using to_equal here because it will just be more expensive. So if you are using primitive types like strings, numbers, booleans, always use to be. But in our case, we're going to be comparing objects, so we want to use to_equal. Just note how that's worked still yet. So I'm going to put it back to what it was before. I think it was something like this: 2, 3, 2, 5, something like that. Oh no, sorry, that was the original array. So I want this to equal, get rid of that, and get rid of this one. So that's what I'm expecting to see eventually. So now I need to start writing the functionality. So the first thing I said was we're going to use a classic for loop using index of. So the main idea for this basically, and this is sort of a brute force way to do it, you're going to create a new array, an empty array, and then you're going to loop over this, starting with the first element, second element, third element, and you're going to check if each element is in that new empty array. So obviously for the first element of the array, it's going to be empty, and then so obviously it won't be in that new array, so you push it to that array. But then when it comes to the second value, it's going to check if 1 is in that new array. So that array is going to have 1 in it already. So if it is, then I don't want it to do anything. I want it to go to the next value. And it's basically just going to loop over that array and do that for everything. So each time it's going to be checking that new array, and as that grows, it's going to become quite long, basically. But it is a way of doing it, so I'm going to show you how to do that. So I'm going to call it, I'm going to say let result equal just an empty array. And then I'll just write a for loop. So syntax for this, and declare I, let I equal 0. So that's the initial value I want to start on, because obviously arrays begin with index 0. And then I want to do I is less than, and I want to do this dynamically, so I'll do numbers dot length. So that's going to read the length of my numbers array, which is going to be 1, 2, 3. It's going to be 6. So this is basically saying start at 0, so here, and then keep going until I is less than numbers dot length, which is 6. So it will stop at the 5th index, which is the 6th element. And then obviously increment by 1 every single loop. So that's the basic structure. And actually what I can do here, if you notice this numbers.length, what I'm basically doing, every time it loops through, it's going to recalculate this numbers.length. Well, this numbers.length isn't changing, so the numbers array stays the same the whole time. So what I can do, I can actually declare this as a variable outside. So I'll say let len, for example, equal to this. And then I just put the variable in there. So that basically means that it's not going to recalculate the length every single time it iterates over my numbers array. So it's just a little sort of efficiency saving there. And then inside here I'm going to want a conditional statement. So I'm just going to build the skeleton of that first. Yeah, and then what I want to do is I want to use the index of. So I want to look into my results array. So I'll say if result.index of, and then I want numbers at index I. If that does not equal -1. So I'll explain this in a second. And then if that's true, I want to do my array dot push, and then obviously numbers I. So it's telling me this has failed at the moment. So if I have a look, it's saying undefined. So obviously here I'm going to want to eventually have this function return something. So I'm just going to return result. So what this is telling me now is that I'm receiving an empty array. So this is really useful to have when you're writing a piece of functionality, because you can see in real time what you're returning at every single stage. So obviously it's expecting this, but it's receiving that, so obviously there's a problem here. So we need to have a look to this. Okay, so the problem here is basically this conditional statement here. So I'll explain what's happening. So basically, inside the ifs conditional statement, I'm saying look at the result array, which is initially empty. I'm saying dot index of numbers I, which on the first iteration will be 1. So basically it's going to look into result and try and find the index for this value. But obviously this array is empty, so it's not going to find an index for that value. So what happens when index of doesn't find what it's looking for? It will return -1. So this is quite hard to read maybe, and it's not immediately obvious what you're trying to do, but obviously it works because obviously this test is passing. So checking if that's in the array basically, and if not, then we're going to push it. So when it gets to the second iteration, it's going to check and see that, well, it's going to return an index basically, and that index will be 0, which is not equal to -1, so it won't push it again. So that's how it's sort of getting rid of the duplicate values. So I hope that's obvious what's happening. So that's the first way you can do it. And like I said, that's a bit hard to understand maybe what's going on. So JavaScript in the new standard, they have this thing called includes. So I'm going to show you how that works now. So it's essentially the same idea. You use a for loop, and inside the loop you push to a new array, and then you return that array. So the first thing I'd notice here is this bit is, yeah, it's kind of hard for someone who's just come and look at this code. Maybe you haven't written this code and it's someone else's. I wouldn't immediately know what's going on here. but I can actually change this and say result.includes numbers I. And then if I negate this, then that's going to pass. So this is just telling me if results doesn't include the element that we're checking in that particular iteration, then push it. So this is a lot more readable, I think. So the third way of doing this might not be the correct way. It depends whether you're interested in having your array sorted or not. So I'm going to comment this out for now. And what I'm going to do first step is sort our numbers array. So I'm going to say I'm going to assign it to a variable. I'm going to say numbers.sort. So this is automatically going to sort it in ascending order. Actually, one thing you can do is just return sorted, and obviously that's going to fail the test, but you can see if you scroll up exactly what you've received. So correct. So this is what we started with. So obviously 2 needs to go before that 3, so it's just shuffled that round, and that's a sorted array now in ascending order. So then what you can do, I'll get rid of this, don't need this anymore. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce a sort of temporary variable. So I'm going to call it temp. And notice how I've just said let temp, and I've not given it an initial value. So that's not going to have a value to start with, but we'll change that in a second. So we're going to use the same structure. It's going to be a for loop. So if I uncomment this, so yeah, let I equals 0, then I++, and then we're going to change what's inside here. So now what we're doing is essentially we're going to look at what numbers I is, and we're going to say if that's not equal to whatever temp is, then we want to push to our results array. I should probably call this results actually. Push to our results array numbers I. So obviously this is failing at the moment because in our loop we also need to assign the current value, if you like. So I'll assign it like this. So essentially what's happening on the first iteration, it's taking 1 and it's saying if numbers I, which is 1, does not equal temp. Well, temp I haven't set to anything on the first iteration, so it's not going to equal that. So it's going to push it to our array, and then temp is going to take the value of 1. Now because we've sorted the array, all numbers are sort of going to, so all repeated numbers are going to appear next to each other. So for the next one it will be 1 again, and obviously now we've set temp to 1, this condition is going to fail. So 1 will be equal to temp, so it's going to skip over this until it gets to a sort of a fresh number, if you like, and then that's going to be pushed to the array and set to the temp variable. So this is another it's a bit neater way of doing it, I think, but obviously if you had a different array it might be different because you're sorting it first, so the resultant array might be different. So you've just got to be careful of that. Depends on what you're expecting really. So the fourth method is using a sort of iterator. So reduce is really powerful actually. So I'm going to use that. So yeah, if I comment this whole thing out actually, you're going to see how many lines of code we save. So I'm going to straight away go try and return something, and it's going to be numbers.reduce. Now reduce takes a callback function, So I'm just going to use an arrow function here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the initial value to an empty array. So this is sort of negating the need having to sort of, you know, declare a new variable and then return it later. This is all sort of included inside the reduce method, so it's really useful. So arguments for this callback function. The first one will be our sort of our current, well, not current value, it will be our accumulator, but I'm going to call that our unique array. So you can call these whatever you like, but I think that's a sort of descriptive name. Yeah, you can actually see if you hover over, it's giving you prompts. So this next one will be current value, so I'm just going to call it current value. And then what we can do inside here, so straight away I want to return my accumulator before I forget. So every loop I'll be returning that, and that's going to change every loop. And then I'm just going to want my if statement inside here. So I'll do if not unique array dot includes the current value. So if the unique array doesn't include the current value, then I'm going to do unique array dot push that current value. So it's similar to what we were doing before, and then return the unique array at the end of every loop. So that's going to iterate over and eventually return our array of unique values. So you can see here how much more compact and concise this is than using a for loop. So I think that's a really good addition to the JavaScript standard. So method number 5, these are sort of becoming more abstract now, but yeah, when we get to this last one, you can see it's probably the best way to do it, and it's a really neat way of doing it. And you can solve this problem in one line rather than having to sort of loop over your array. So first of all, we'll create a new object and try and get its keys. So I'm going to comment this out and just start working down here. I know this is a bit messy, but it's just sort of so you can see and you can compare them. So this is going to be using a for of loop. So I'm going to declare a few things. So the first thing I'm going to do here is declare a new object. So I'm just going to call it obj like that. And I'm going to set it to an empty object to start with. And then I'm going to sort of add properties to this using a for of loop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to for let I of numbers, our array. So that's going to sort of go through each element of our array. And then for that, I want to go to my object and I want to go to the sort of ith. So I want to go to my object and then I want to go to my object and sort of create a key value pair. So I'm just going to call this, well, you can set it to true, you can set it to a string hello. But basically I'm creating an object with all these keys and then their values are going to be hello. But the thing this is doing, so if I now return my object, I can see what it's done. So yeah, you can see received this. So what's happened here? Basically, pardon me, I've got the keys are the unique values from this array. So by default, it will create a sort of, it will ignore all the duplicates for for key names, because obviously it's looping over and it's going to try and overwrite it under the same value. So, and then what we can do, because we have the unique values as the keys, we can sort of extract them. So there's a very neat way of doing this. We can do capital O object. You can see it's turned a different color there. Object dot not values keys, and then we can just insert our object that we're trying to extract the keys from. So that's going to be obj, I've called it. So if I return, I get rid of this, and I just return this line, clean up a bit. So this is going to fail, but you can see this has returned me. So expected it to equal these numbers, but it's got quotations around them, so obviously it's received these numbers as strings. So this is a problem which isn't too hard to solve. So what you can do is you can use the map method on the array, and basically what map does, it takes each element and maps it to another element. So it will take an array of, say, in this case, 4 elements, and map it to another array of 4 elements, implementing whatever change you want to do. So I'll do dot map on here, and then map takes a function. So inside here I'll do an arrow function, and then I'm just going to call it key. And then inside here I want to return, I want to change it to a number from a string, each individual key. And you can see here that's passed the test. So yeah, I've just changed each one to a number basically, because that was the problem. So that's one way of doing it. So as you can see, it's sort of quite nice and concise, and you don't need to loop through it really. Oh, you do, but this is a nicer way of looping really. But I'll comment that out, and I'll get on to our very last way of doing this, creating a new set. So this is the most elegant way to do it, and it's really nice actually. You can do it in one line. So what I'm going to do here is do return, and I'll explain what I've done afterwards, like this, from numbers. As you can see, that's passed the test. So what have I done here? So if I get rid of the brackets and everything, so what I'm doing is I'm essentially creating a new set from the numbers array. And if I see what this is returning me, it's saying, look, set, and then all these values. So by default, when you create a new set, it will only include the unique values from the array. And then what I'm doing, because this isn't in an array, I want to have it in an array, so I'm going to use the rest operator to sort of spread those numbers and then capture them in an array like this, and then it's going to have the same format as what we were expecting to equal in our test over here. So this is probably my favourite way to do it. I hope that's cleared up a few sort of so yeah, like I said, this is probably my favourite way to do it, so I can get rid of all this, and you can see this problem can actually be solved in one line of code. I hope that's been useful for some people, especially the test-driven development. That's really really useful. It's really good for creating sort of quality code, because now if somebody comes to my code in 6 months' time and breaks it, straight away it's going to start telling them that I've broken a test. So that's really useful for creating like good quality scalable apps.